The wind off the mountains didn't care that it was April. It came down mean and cold, rattling the shutters on the general store and sending up little dust devils in the street where the snow had finally melted enough to show the ruts from last November's supply wagons. Black Hollow wasn't much to look at on a good day. A scatter of weathered buildings pressed up against the eastern slope of the Bitterroots, connected by mud streets and optimism that wore thinner every winter. But it was alive. Barely. And that was mostly because of one man. Sheriff Gideon Vale stood on the depot platform at 5:30 in the morning, his breath fogging in the lamplight as he swept yesterday's coal dust into neat piles. Nobody asked him to do it. The railroad company sure as hell didn't pay him for it. But Gideon swept that platform every morning before the freight train came through, same as he'd done for 12 years, because he believed a town that looked like it gave a damn might actually start giving one. He was 53 years old and looked older. His face had the kind of lines you earned, not the kind you were born with. Deep brackets around his mouth from smiling at children who needed to believe adults weren't all bastards. Crow's feet from squinting into too many sunrises searching for trouble on the horizon. A scar across his left eyebrow from the time he'd stepped between a drunk miner and his wife, with nothing but his bare hands and good intentions. The badge on his coat was tarnished. His boots needed resoling. The Remington on his hip hadn't been fired in 8 months, and that was exactly how he liked it. "Morning, Gideon," the voice came from the darkness beyond the platform. Gideon didn't look up from his sweeping. "Morning, Thomas. You're up early." Thomas Bentley emerged into the lamplight, 40 years old, stocky, with the permanently worried expression of a man who'd inherited a failing mercantile from a father who'd been better at drinking than bookkeeping. He was carrying a flour sack that clearly didn't contain flour. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas said. He set the sack down on the bench with the careful heaviness of something that would break if dropped. "Martha's worried." "Martha's always worried." "Yeah, well," Thomas rubbed his face. "This time she might have a point." Gideon finally stopped sweeping. He leaned the broom against the station wall and turned to face Thomas properly. In the lamplight, the shopkeeper looked like hell. Hollow-eyed, unshaven, the kind of exhausted that came from fear, not work. "Riders came through yesterday evening," Thomas said quietly. 4 of them. Stopped at the store for supplies, paid in silver coin, real money, not scrip. Didn't say much, but Martha said they had that look." "What look?" "You know the look, Gideon." And he did. In 12 years of wearing the badge in Black Hollow, Gideon had learned to read men the way some people read weather. The set of their shoulders, the way their eyes moved when they talked, whether their hands stayed still or drifted toward their guns when someone walked behind them. Most men were easy. Miners carried their exhaustion like stones in their pockets. Ranchers moved like they were still on horseback even when their feet were on solid ground. Drifters passing through had a hungry restlessness that marked them from 100 yards away. But the dangerous ones, the real dangerous ones, they had a stillness to them, a patience. Like wolves who'd learned that if you waited long enough, something would wander close enough to kill. They say where they were headed? North, maybe. Or they were lying. Thomas picked up the flour sack again. His hands shook slightly. "Gideon, Martha wants to close the store for a few days. Go stay with her sister in Copper Bend until things settle." "Things are settled." "Are they?" Gideon looked past Thomas toward the dark outline of the town. The shapes of buildings he could navigate blind, the homes of people whose children he'd helped raise, whose disputes he'd mediated, whose winters he'd helped them survive when the passes closed and the supply train stopped running. 4 riders don't make an invasion, Gideon said. Could be they're just passing through. Could be. But you don't think so. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to. Gideon sighed and picked up his broom again. "Tell Martha to keep the store open. Tell her I'll stop by this afternoon, have some coffee, let people see everything's normal. That'll settle her nerves. And if it's not normal, then we'll handle it when it stops being normal." Gideon started sweeping again, the bristles making their familiar scraping rhythm against the worn planks. "Go on home, Thomas. Get some sleep. Your girls need you clear-headed." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He was halfway down the platform steps when he stopped and turned back. "Gideon? Yeah? You ever think about leaving? Just getting out while you still can?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Gideon kept sweeping, but slower now. "Every winter," he said finally. "Every time the temperature drops below zero and the supply wagons stop coming, and I'm trying to figure out how to stretch 3 weeks of food across 6 weeks of snow. So why don't you?" Gideon looked up. In the lamplight, his face showed every one of his 53 years, but his eyes were steady. "Because somebody has to give a damn," he said, "and I'm tired of waiting for it to be someone else." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood. Everyone in Black Hollow understood, whether they admitted it or not. Gideon Vale wasn't just the sheriff. He was the thing that kept the town from sliding into the same casual brutality that infected every other frontier settlement where the law was whatever the man with the biggest gun said it was. "See you at the store," Thomas said. "See you at the store." Thomas disappeared into the darkness. Gideon finished his sweeping, dumped the coal dust off the edge of the platform, and was putting the broom away when he heard the horses. Not the usual sound of a rider passing through. Multiple horses. Moving fast. Coming from the north where the road curved around the base of the mountain. Gideon's hand didn't go to his gun. That would have been the move of a younger man, a stupider man, someone who still believed fast hands solved more problems than they created. Instead, he stepped back into the shadow of the station overhang and waited. 4 riders came into view in the pre-dawn gloom. They weren't trying to be quiet. They rode straight down the main street at a canter, their horses' hooves loud in the silence, their silhouettes dark against the slowly lightening sky. When they reached the depot, they spread out in a loose semicircle, blocking the platform from 3 sides. Professional. Military, almost. The kind of positioning that came from experience, not luck. Gideon stayed in the shadows, but he spoke clearly. "Help you gentlemen with something?" The lead rider was a big man, broad-shouldered, thick-armed, with the kind of body that came from actual work, not just violence. His face was hidden by the darkness and the brim of his hat, but his voice was educated, almost refined. "Sheriff Vale?" "That's right." "We need to talk." "So talk." "Not here. Somewhere private." "I'm comfortable where I am." The rider shifted in his saddle. His horse, a big bay gelding, snorted and tossed its head. "This doesn't have to be difficult." "Then make it easy," Gideon said. "State your business or ride on through." For a moment, nobody moved. The 4 riders sat their horses, silhouettes against the dawn, and Gideon stood in the shadows with his hand nowhere near his gun because putting it there would only escalate things, and escalation was how people died. Then the lead rider reached into his coat. Gideon tensed. Not much, just enough to shift his weight onto the balls of his feet, just enough to be ready to move if a gun came out. But what the man pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was an envelope. Cream-colored, expensive paper, sealed with red wax. "We were told to deliver this to you personally," the rider said. He urged his horse forward 2 steps and extended the envelope toward the platform. "We're just messengers. Messengers with guns. It's that kind of territory." Gideon stepped out of the shadows slowly. He kept his hands visible, his movements deliberate. When he reached the edge of the platform, he took the envelope without looking away from the rider's face. "Who sent you?" "The letter will explain." "I'm asking you." The rider didn't answer. He pulled his horse back and turned toward his companions. "Our job's done. Let's go." "Hold on," Gideon said. "I've got questions." "Read the letter, Sheriff." The 4 riders turned their horses as smoothly as if they'd rehearsed it. Within seconds, they were cantering back up the main street, disappearing into the half-light of early morning as quickly as they'd come. Gideon stood on the platform holding the envelope, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fade into silence. Behind him, lamplight spilled from the station house windows. Around him, Black Hollow was starting to wake up. Smoke rising from chimneys, dogs barking, the faint clatter of someone starting early morning chores. He broke the wax seal and pulled out the letter. The handwriting was immaculate, the kind of script taught in expensive schools back east, all flowing loops and perfect spacing. But the message was simple. "Sheriff Vale, you don't know me, but I know you. I know you've spent 12 years protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I know you're the reason Black Hollow hasn't torn itself apart like every other frontier town infected with greed and desperation. I know you're a good man. That's going to be a problem. There's a man coming to Black Hollow. His name is Rhett Mercer, and he's not coming to help you. He's coming because I invited him, because I need him here, Because the only bait strong enough to catch a legend is a man worth saving. When he arrives, you'll tell him where to find me. Not because I'm threatening you. Threats are crude, and you've probably faced worse. You'll tell him because the alternative is letting this town discover what happens when good men try to fight battles they can't win. The choice is yours, Sheriff. But choose quickly. The freight train arrives in 4 hours. I'll be on it. The letter wasn't signed. Gideon read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. His hands were steady. They'd been steady through 12 years of frontier justice, through blizzards and fistfights, and the time a drunk prospector had put a knife to his throat in the middle of the street. They'd stay steady now. But his mind was racing. Rhett Mercer. The name landed in his chest like a stone dropped into dark water. Everyone in the territories knew that name. It carried the weight of legend and nightmare in equal measure. Stories spread about Rhett Mercer the way stories spread about avalanches and prairie fires, warnings wrapped in awe and fear. They said he'd tracked a band of raiders through 3 territories in the middle of winter and brought back 7 bodies strapped to their own horses. They said he'd faced down a corrupt marshal in Deadwood and walked away while the marshal bled out in the street. They said he could read trail sign like some men read books, that he could shoot running targets at 200 yards, that he'd never lost a man he'd gone to find. They also said he had no mercy, that his justice was absolute, that if you were on the wrong side of whatever line Rhett Mercer had drawn, you didn't get second chances. Gideon had never met the man, never wanted to. Men like Rhett Mercer were lightning, beautiful in their power, useful in their destruction, but not the kind of thing you invited into your life if you had any choice in the matter. And now someone was inviting him here, using Gideon as bait. The question was why. The sun was starting to break over the eastern peaks now, sending long shadows across the street. Gideon could see lights in more windows. The town coming to life the way it did every morning, people starting routines they'd followed for years because routines were what kept you sane when everything else was trying to kill you. He thought about Thomas's question. You ever think about leaving? Yeah. He'd thought about it. But thinking and doing were different things, and Gideon had never been good at running from problems, even when running was the smart move. The freight train would arrive at 9:30. That gave him 4 hours to figure out what the hell was happening and how to keep his town from getting caught in the middle of whatever this was. He walked back into the station house. The station master, a rail-thin man named Cooper, who'd worked for the railroad for 30 years, was brewing coffee on the potbelly stove. Morning, Gideon. Morning. Cooper, when's the next passenger train coming through? Cooper poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed one to Gideon. Not until Saturday. Why? Somebody's coming in on the freight train this morning. I need to know who. Cooper frowned. Freight doesn't carry passengers. This one might be different. Even if it is, I wouldn't know. Manifest comes sealed from division. I just sign for the cargo and send it on through. He sipped his coffee, studying Gideon over the rim of his cup. This about those riders earlier? You saw them? Heard them. Woke me up. Thought maybe there was trouble. Not yet, Gideon said. He drank his coffee fast, burning his tongue. Do me a favor. When that train pulls in, keep your head down. Stay inside the station house. Don't come out until I tell you it's clear. Cooper set down his cup slowly. That kind of trouble? I don't know yet. But I'd rather you stay safe while I figure it out. What about you? I'll be fine. Will you? Gideon didn't answer. He finished his coffee, set the empty cup on the counter, and walked back outside into the growing daylight. Black Hollow looked peaceful. Deceptively peaceful. The kind of peaceful that made you forget how fast things could go wrong, how quickly a quiet morning could turn into screaming and blood, and people learning exactly how thin the line was between civilization and chaos. He'd kept that from happening for 12 years. He wasn't about to stop now. But as he stood on the platform watching the sun rise over his town, Gideon Vale felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not for himself. He'd made peace with his own mortality years ago. But for Black Hollow. For Thomas and Martha and their daughters. For the miners who trusted him to keep them safe. For the families who'd built lives here because they believed this place was different. That maybe out here on the edge of the world, they could find something resembling decency. That fear sat cold in his chest as the minutes ticked by and the sun climbed higher and the town went about its morning completely unaware that everything was about to change. At 9:15, he heard the train whistle in the distance. By 9:20, he could see the smoke from the engine rising above the tree line. At 9:28, the freight train rounded the bend and began slowing for the station. Gideon stood alone on the platform, his hand resting on the worn grip of his Remington, and waited. The train shuddered to a stop with a screech of brakes and a hiss of steam. Cooper emerged from the station house despite Gideon's warning, moving down the platform to the cargo car where the railroad company always loaded local deliveries. "Cooper," Gideon called, "stay back!" But the station master was already pulling open the cargo door, already reaching for the manifest clipboard hanging inside. Nothing happened. The cargo car was empty except for 3 crates of mining equipment and a pallet of tinned goods. Cooper checked the manifest, frowned, and called back to Gideon. "Nothing unusual here, just the regular shipment." Gideon felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe whoever had sent that letter had been bluffing, testing him, trying to... The passenger car door opened. It shouldn't have. Freight trains didn't have passenger cars. But this one did. A single coach coupled behind the cargo car, painted the same weathered brown as the rest of the train, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A man stepped out onto the platform. He was average height, average build, dressed in trail clothes that had seen hard use, canvas pants, a worn leather jacket, boots caked with dried mud. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. He carried a single bag, canvas and leather, slung over one shoulder. Nothing about him screamed danger. Nothing about him looked like the letters written after his name. But Gideon knew. He'd seen enough dangerous men to recognize the real thing when it stood 20 feet away, drinking in its surroundings with the kind of attention that missed nothing. "Rhett Mercer," Gideon said. Not a question. The man pushed his hat back slightly. His face was weathered, mid-40s maybe, with a crooked nose that had been broken badly and healed worse. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter sky before a storm. "Sheriff Vale," Mercer said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "We need to talk." "Seems like everyone wants to talk this morning." "I'm not everyone." "No," Gideon agreed. "You're not." Behind Mercer, the train was already starting to pull away. Cooper had given the all-clear signal, and the engineer wasn't waiting around. Within seconds, the freight train was disappearing back down the line, leaving Mercer standing alone on the platform with his single bag and his reputation. "Letter said you'd know where to find someone," Mercer said. "Letter said a lot of things." "Then you know why I'm here." "I know someone thinks I'm stupid enough to be used as bait." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Mercer's mouth. "You're not bait, Sheriff. You're the point. The thing worth protecting. That's what makes this work." "Makes what work?" "The trap." "Whose trap, yours or theirs?" "Does it matter?" Gideon's hand was still resting on his gun, but he hadn't drawn it. Drawing would be an escalation, and he still wasn't sure what he was escalating toward. "It matters to me," Gideon said. "It matters to this town. Whatever business you've got, whoever sent you that letter, Black Hollow doesn't need to be in the middle of it. Black Hollow's been in the middle of it since someone decided I'd care enough about you to walk into a kill zone." "And do you care?" Mercer shifted his bag to his other shoulder. "I don't know you, Sheriff, but I know what you represent. I know what it means when someone picks you specifically because you're the kind of man worth saving." He paused. "That means someone thinks I'm the kind of man who'd try to save you." "Are you?" Mercer didn't answer right away. He looked past Gideon toward the town, the weathered buildings, the people starting their days, the ordinary life happening in the shadow of mountains that didn't care whether any of them lived or died. 5 years ago, Mercer said finally, I humiliated a man named Silas Boone, caught him running a crooked card game in Laramie, took his money, ran him out of town in front of everyone who'd ever feared him, made him look weak, made him look stupid. Should have killed him? Probably. But he seemed harmless, just a con artist, not a killer. I thought humiliation was enough. Mercer's jaw tightened. I was wrong. This Silas, he's the one who sent the letter? Has to be. Nobody else hates me enough to spend 5 years planning something this elaborate. Gideon absorbed that. 5 years. That was longer than most feuds lasted out here, where violence tended to be immediate and final. 5 years meant obsession. It meant patience. It meant whoever this Silas was, he'd stopped being a con artist and become something worse. "Where is he?" Gideon asked. "That's what I'm here to find out." "And you think I know?" "I think someone told you, or will tell you. That's how this works." Mercer's pale eyes were steady on Gideon's face. "He needs you to point me toward him, Sheriff. That's your role in this. The respected lawman who confirms the location, who makes sure I walk into whatever trap he's built with my eyes open. And if I don't, then he'll hurt someone until you do." The words landed like stones. Gideon felt his chest tighten. "You're saying he'll attack the town." "I'm saying he didn't go to this much trouble just to give up if you refuse to cooperate. He'll escalate, make an example, kill someone you care about in front of everyone to prove he's serious." Mercer's voice was still quiet, still almost gentle, but there was something terrible in it now. "That's how men like Silas work. They don't have the courage to face you directly, so they hurt the people around you until you break." Gideon's mind was racing through possibilities, through worst-case scenarios, through the names of everyone in Black Hollow who might be vulnerable, who might be... "Sheriff?" The voice came from the street. Gideon turned to see Thomas running toward the platform, his face flushed, his breath coming hard. "Thomas, what—" "It's Martha," Thomas gasped. "She's gone. The girls came down this morning and found the front door open. No sign of her anywhere. I've been searching for an hour. I thought maybe she went to the bakery early, but nobody's seen her and there's—" He stopped, noticing Mercer for the first time. "Who's this?" Gideon didn't answer. He was already moving, already descending the platform steps, his mind calculating timelines and possibilities. "When did you last see her?" he asked Thomas. "Last night, around 8. She said she was tired, went up to bed early, but this morning—" "The bed?" "Slept in, or made to look slept in. I don't know." Thomas's voice was cracking. "Gideon, where's my wife?" Behind them, Mercer spoke quietly. "He has her." Thomas spun around. "Who the hell are you?" "The reason she was taken," Mercer said. He looked at Gideon. "This is the escalation, Sheriff. He's showing you what happens if you don't cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" Thomas demanded. "What's he talking about?" Gideon's mind was still racing, but a cold certainty was settling over him. The letter, the timing, the fact that Martha had disappeared the same night the 4 riders had come through town. "Where is she?" he asked Mercer. "I don't know yet." "Guess." "Abandoned rail station, 20 miles north. It's been out of service for 2 years. Perfect place for an ambush. Isolated, defensible, close enough to watch, but far enough to keep you from getting help." Mercer's voice was still calm, still analytical. "That's where I'd set the trap." "Then that's where we're going," Gideon said. "No." The word was flat, absolute. "That's where I'm going, alone." "The hell you are—" "This isn't a negotiation, Sheriff." Mercer's eyes were hard now. "Silas wants me to walk into that station knowing it's a trap. He wants me to try to be a hero, to save the innocent woman, to prove I'm still the legend everyone thinks I am. That's the whole point. And if you come with me, if you try to help, you're just giving him more leverage, more hostages, more ways to make me do exactly what he wants." "So what?" Thomas's voice was shaking. "We just let you walk into a trap? Let you get yourself killed?" "I've walked into traps before," Mercer said. "I'm still here." "What about Martha?" For the first time, something like sympathy crossed Mercer's face. "If she's still alive, and she is because Silas needs her alive to make this work, then I'll bring her back. That's what I do." "And if you can't?" Mercer didn't answer that. He turned to Gideon instead. "I need a horse, supplies, and I need you to stay here and keep this town calm. Because if Silas gets even a hint that you're mobilizing men to follow me, he'll start killing people just to prove he can." "You're asking me to do nothing," Gideon said. "I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing." "I don't know you." "No," Mercer agreed. "But you know what happens if you don't let me try." The 2 men stood facing each other in the morning sunlight. The sheriff who'd spent 12 years protecting his town through patience and diplomacy, and the gunfighter who'd spent his life solving problems with violence and reputation. Thomas was looking between them, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. "Please," he said, Please bring her back. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. I'll bring her back, he said, or I won't come back at all. And somehow, standing there on the main street of Black Hollow, with the sun climbing higher and the ordinary sounds of the town continuing around them, Gideon believed him. Not because Rhett Mercer was a hero, but because he was a man who'd made promises before and lived with the consequences of keeping them. Cooper, Gideon called toward the station. Saddle my horse. Sheriff, Mercer started. Not for you, Gideon interrupted. For me. I'm not following you, but I'm going to the edge of town and I'm going to wait. And if you're not back by sunset with Martha Bentley alive and well, I'm coming after you with every man in this town who can hold a rifle. That'll get them killed. Then you better not make me do it. Mercer studied Gideon's face for a moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. Cooper brought the horse, a reliable chestnut mare that had carried Gideon through 12 winters. Mercer swung into the saddle with the ease of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on his own feet. 20 miles north, Gideon said. Abandoned rail station. You'll see the siding from the main line about 18 miles out. I know the place. Of course you do. Something that might have been humor flickered in Mercer's eyes. Then he touched the brim of his hat, turned the mare north, and rode out of Black Hollow at an easy canter. Thomas stood watching until horse and rider disappeared around the bend. Then he turned to Gideon, his face ravaged. Is she going to die? Gideon wanted to lie. Wanted to say something comforting, something certain. But Thomas deserved better than empty promises. I don't know, he said honestly. But if anyone can bring her back, it's him. How do you know? Because men like Rhett Mercer don't survive this long by failing. Thomas nodded numbly. He looked lost, broken, like a man whose world had just been revealed as far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. Go home, Gideon said gently. Take care of your girls. I'll come by later. And if he doesn't come back? Then we do what we've always done, Gideon said. We handle it ourselves. He watched Thomas walk away, shoulders slumped, moving like a man underwater. Around them, Black Hollow was fully awake now. People emerging from shops, children running in the street, the day progressing exactly the way it had progressed for years. But everything had changed. Gideon could feel it in his bones, in the cold weight that had settled into his chest when he'd opened that letter. Something had been set in motion this morning that couldn't be stopped, only survived. And somewhere 20 miles north, a man named Silas Boone was waiting for the legend he'd spent 5 years learning to destroy. Gideon walked back to the station house, poured himself another cup of coffee, and settled in to wait. By his watch, Mercer had been gone 6 minutes. Sunset was 11 hours away. It was going to be a very long day. The mare was good. Gideon had chosen well. She had steady legs and didn't spook at shadows, which mattered when you were riding into the kind of situation that got most men killed. Rhett kept her at an easy pace for the first hour, letting her warm up, conserving her strength for whatever was coming. The road north cut through pine forest thick enough to make noon feel like dusk. Snow still clung to the shadowed places where sunlight never reached, and the air had that brittle quality that meant winter wasn't quite done with the mountains yet. Rhett had ridden this country before, years back, tracking a group of claim jumpers who'd thought the wilderness would hide them. It hadn't. Nothing stayed hidden forever. Not out here. The land kept its secrets for a while, but eventually everything came to light. Bodies, lies, the truth about who you really were when nobody was watching. Silas Boone had learned that the hard way in Laramie. Rhett remembered that night clearly, even though it had been 5 years. He'd been passing through, stopping for supplies and a hot meal, when he'd noticed the card game in the back of the saloon. Nothing unusual about that. Frontier towns ran on whiskey and gambling the way cities ran on trade and industry. But something about the dealer had caught his attention. The way his hands moved. Too smooth, too practiced. Rhett had watched 3 hands before he'd seen the switch. Palm work so slick most people would have missed it. The dealer was running a crooked game, and the miners losing their wages to him had no idea. A smarter man would have walked away. It wasn't Rhett's business, wasn't his town. The miners were grown men who'd chosen to sit down at that table. But Rhett had never been particularly smart about walking away from things that pissed him off. He'd sat down at the table, played 4 hands, and on the 5th, he'd caught the dealer's wrist mid-switch, held it there in front of everyone. Let them see the extra cards palmed against his skin. Let them understand exactly how they'd been cheated. The dealer, Silas Boone, though Rhett hadn't known his name yet, had gone pale, started stammering excuses, said it was a misunderstanding, that Rhett had it wrong, that Rhett had taken every dollar on that table and given it back to the miners who'd lost it. Then he'd taken Silas outside into the street and made him empty his pockets. $400 in stolen wages. Rhett had held it up for everyone to see. "This is what happens when you let cowards steal from you," he'd said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "This is what happens when you're too drunk or too stupid to notice you're being played." Then he'd turned to Silas, who was on his knees in the dirt, and said the words that had apparently echoed in the man's head for 5 years. "You're not dangerous enough to kill. You're just pathetic. Go be pathetic somewhere else." The crowd had laughed. Someone had thrown mud. Silas had scrambled to his feet and run, and Rhett had thought that was the end of it. But humiliation was a strange thing. Some men absorbed it and moved on. Others let it fester, let it become the center of their identity, let it transform them into something they'd never been before. Silas had chosen the second path. The mare snorted, pulling Rhett back to the present. They'd been riding for 2 hours now, and the forest was starting to thin. He could see open country ahead, rolling foothills marked with patches of snow and the dark lines of dry creek beds. Somewhere out there, Silas was waiting. The question was what he'd become in 5 years. Con artists didn't usually turn into killers, but desperation and obsession could reshape a man into almost anything. And someone who'd spent 5 years planning revenge wasn't operating on normal logic anymore. They'd crossed over into something colder, something more patient, something more dangerous. Rhett pulled the mare to a stop at the edge of the tree line and studied the terrain ahead. From here he could see the old rail line cutting across the valley like a scar, and about 3 miles further north, the dark shape of the abandoned station. It looked quiet, empty, exactly like a place nobody would bother visiting unless they had a reason, or a trap to walk into. He sat there for a long moment, letting his eyes track across the landscape, looking for movement, for anything that didn't belong. Horses would be hidden, men would be under cover. But there were always signs if you knew how to read them. Birds that stopped singing, animals that changed their patterns, the subtle wrongness of a place where violence was waiting to happen. The valley felt dead, not quiet, dead. Like everything with sense had already fled. Rhett urged the mare forward at a walk. His right hand rested on his thigh, close to his gun, but not touching it. Drawing now would accomplish nothing except making him feel better, and feeling better wasn't going to keep him alive. The ride down into the valley took 30 minutes. The rail line was overgrown with weeds, the ties rotting, the metal rails showing rust where they hadn't been maintained. The railroad company had abandoned this spur 2 years ago when the mine it serviced played out. Now it was just a monument to optimism that hadn't panned out, like half the dreams people brought to the frontier. The station sat at the end of the line, a single building with a loading platform, a water tower that had partially collapsed, and a cluster of smaller structures that had probably been storage sheds. Everything was weathered gray, the wood bleached by sun and scoured by wind until it barely looked like it had ever been painted. Rhett stopped the mare 200 yards out. "I know you're there," he called. His voice carried across the empty valley, bouncing off the mountains. "Let's talk." Silence. Then a door opened on the main station building. A figure emerged onto the platform, tall, thin, dressed in a suit that looked expensive and completely out of place in this setting. Even from 200 yards, Rhett recognized him. Silas Boone had aged badly. The man who'd run out of Laramie had been soft, well-fed, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from successfully lying to people for years. This version was gaunt, almost skeletal, his movements sharp and nervous. 5 years of obsession had hollowed him out, left him looking like a man who'd forgotten how to sleep, or eat, or do anything except plot revenge. "Rhett Mercer," Silas called back. His voice was higher than Rhett remembered, strained. "You came. You took a woman. What did you think would happen?" "I thought you'd bring the sheriff. I work alone. Always." Silas laughed, but it didn't sound happy. It sounded broken. The great Rhett Mercer, the legend, the man who never needs help because he's just that much better than everyone else. "Where's Martha Bentley?" "Safe. For now." Silas spread his arms wide. "Come see for yourself. Rhett didn't move. He was scanning the buildings, the shadows, looking for the gunmen he knew were there. Silas wasn't stupid enough to do this alone, which meant he'd hired help. Professional help, probably, given how smoothly the abduction had gone. "How many men do you have?" Rhett asked. "Enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting." Silas stepped to the edge of the platform. "Here's how this works, Mercer. You're going to ride up here slowly. You're going to dismount. You're going to surrender your weapons, and then we're going to have a conversation about respect." Respect. That's right. About what it means to destroy a man in front of everyone he's ever known. About what it costs to be humiliated so thoroughly that you spend 5 years rebuilding yourself just to get one chance to return the favor. Rhett sat quiet for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. Then he spoke, and his voice was different now. Not threatening, just tired. "Silas, you were cheating miners out of their wages. Men who worked 16-hour days in the dark, breaking their bodies for money you were stealing with card tricks. What did you expect me to do? Not make me look like nothing? You were nothing, a con artist preying on desperate men. I was surviving by stealing from people who had less than you." Silas's face twisted. Even from this distance, Rhett could see the rage there, the years of humiliation curdling into something toxic. "You should have killed me," Silas said quietly. "Probably. Now you're going to regret it." Rhett nudged the mare forward slowly. "Where's the woman, Silas?" "Inside. Tied up. Scared. Wondering if she's going to see her husband and children again." Silas's smile was ugly. "Wondering if the great Rhett Mercer is really as good as the stories say. I need to see her. Proof of life. You're not in a position to make demands." "Then we're at an impasse." Rhett stopped the mare 50 yards from the platform. "Because I'm not surrendering my weapons until I know she's alive." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, rattling through the broken windows of the station, making a sound like breathing. Then Silas turned and called back into the building. "Bring her out." A door opened. 2 men emerged, dragging a third figure between them. Even from this distance, Rhett could see it was a woman. Middle-aged, disheveled, her hands bound in front of her. She wasn't fighting, but she wasn't cooperating either. She looked exhausted, terrified, but still aware enough to know exactly how much danger she was in. The men brought her to the edge of the platform and stopped. One of them held a gun loosely, not pointed at her, but close enough that the threat was clear. "Satisfied?" Silas called. Rhett studied the scene. Martha Bentley was alive. That was good. But she was also being held by professionals. The men flanking her moved like they'd done this kind of work before, and their positioning kept her between them and any potential shooter. Which meant Silas had spent money, real money. The kind of money it took to hire gunmen who knew what they were doing. 5 years was a long time to save up for revenge. "Let her go," Rhett said, "after we talk." "Then let's talk. Dismount first. Slowly." Rhett swung down from the saddle, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. His hand stayed away from his gun, not because he was surrendering, not yet, but because rushing this would get Martha killed and probably him too. "Walk forward," Silas said. "Stop at the platform steps." Rhett walked. 30 yards. 20. 10. The platform steps were weathered and half-rotted, probably hadn't held weight in years. Up close, the station looked even more decrepit. Broken windows, a door hanging from one hinge, graffiti scratched into the walls by bored travelers or desperate men looking to leave some mark that they'd existed. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at Silas. The man who'd run out of Laramie 5 years ago was gone completely. What stood on that platform now was something sharp and bitter, something that had spent so long nursing its wounds that the wounds had become its entire identity. "You know why you're here?" Silas asked. "Because you want to prove something. I want to unmake you, the same way you unmade me. I stopped you from cheating people. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" Silas's voice cracked slightly. "You made me nothing in front of everyone. Made them laugh at me. Made me run like a dog with my tail between my legs. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Probably felt like being a miner who just lost a week's wages to a card cheat. Silas's face darkened. "You think you're righteous. That's your problem. You think because you follow some code, some set of rules you made up in your head, that gives you the right to judge everyone else. I think stealing is wrong, Rhett said simply. I think preying on desperate people makes you garbage. And I think if being called out for that broke you so badly you spent 5 years plotting revenge, then you were already broken before I ever sat down at your table. The words landed like punches. Silas took a step back, his face going white, then red. Get his guns, he snapped. The two men holding Martha moved. One of them pushed her roughly toward the door while the other descended the platform steps, his own weapon drawn and pointed at Rhett's chest. Real slow, the gunman said. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of cold eyes that said he'd killed before and would do it again without much thought. 2 fingers. Lift the gun out and toss it to the side. Rhett didn't move. I said, I heard you. Rhett's voice was calm. But here's the thing. You shoot me, and whatever Silas is paying you doesn't matter because you'll never collect it. The sheriff back in Black Hollow knows exactly where I am. He's waiting. And if I don't come back with that woman by sunset, he's coming here with every armed man in town. The gunman hesitated. His eyes flicked to Silas, looking for confirmation. He's bluffing, Silas said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Am I? Rhett kept his eyes on the gunman. You know who Sheriff Vale is? You know what he's been doing for 12 years? Protecting that town. Keeping it together. You think he's going to let his people get killed by some revenge plot he had nothing to do with? The gunman was still hesitating. That was good. Hesitation meant doubt, and doubt meant there was a chance to shoot him in the leg, Silas said. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, and Rhett moved, not toward the gun. That would have been suicide. He moved sideways and down, dropping below the line of fire while his hand swept up toward his own weapon. The gunman fired, but the shot went wide, punching through the space where Rhett had been standing a half-second earlier. Then Rhett's gun was out and up, and the world narrowed to the simple geometry of aim and trigger pull. He shot the gunman in the shoulder, not center mass, not a kill shot, because killing this man would just escalate everything and make the next few minutes impossible. The gunman went down with a scream, his weapon clattering across the dirt. Rhett rolled behind the platform steps, using the rotting wood as cover while his mind raced through possibilities. He could hear shouting from inside the station. More men, at least 3 or 4 by the sound of it, all moving toward the doors and windows. Martha was screaming. Silas was yelling something, but Rhett couldn't make out the words over the chaos. This had gone wrong, fast, faster than he'd expected. But that didn't mean it was over. Rhett took a breath, steadied himself, and called out loud enough to cut through the noise. Silas! You want to talk? Let's talk! But the next person who points a gun at me dies. The shouting stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the gunman Rhett had shot whimpering in the dirt 20 feet away. Then Silas's voice came from inside the station, strained and shaking. You just proved my point, Mercer. You walk into every situation thinking you're in control, thinking you can dictate terms. I'm dictating one term, Rhett called back. Let Martha Bentley go. She's got nothing to do with whatever's between us. She's everything to do with it. She's the bait that got you here. She's the reason you're exposed and vulnerable and about to learn exactly what it feels like when someone strips away everything that makes you who you are. Rhett was already moving, shifting position while Silas talked, putting distance between himself and where his voice had been coming from. The wounded gunman was trying to crawl away, leaving a blood trail in the dirt. Rhett kicked the man's weapon further out of reach and kept moving. The station had 3 ways out: the main door, a side door near the water tower, and the windows. Men would be covering all of them, which meant staying outside was suicide, but going inside was walking into an ambush, unless he made them come to him. You spent 5 years planning this, Rhett called. He was crouched behind the water tower now, using its bulk for cover. 5 years obsessing over me, building this trap, hiring these men, and all of it's falling apart because you're too angry to think straight. I'm thinking perfectly clearly. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you've got a hostage you can't leverage, a wounded gunman bleeding out in the dirt, and me still armed and mobile. This isn't going the way you imagined, is it? Silence from inside the station. Rhett could practically hear Silas's mind working, recalculating, trying to figure out how to salvage the plan. Then a window shattered. Rhett dropped flat as gunfire erupted from multiple positions. 2 windows, the main door, coordinated and vicious. Bullets punched through the water tower, sending splinters of rotting wood flying. Rhett pressed himself into the dirt, making himself as small as possible, while lead screamed through the air inches above his head. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then the shooting stopped. Rhett didn't move. He stayed flat, breathing dust, counting seconds, waiting for someone to make a mistake. It came 20 seconds later, a boot scraping on wood, someone positioning themselves for a better angle. Rhett surged up from behind the water tower and fired 3 times at the window where the sound had come from. He didn't know if he hit anyone, but someone swore loudly and pulled back. Then he was running, not away from the station but toward it, closing the distance while they were still reacting. He hit the sidewall hard, pressing his back against the weathered boards, his gun up and ready. Inside he could hear voices arguing. Told you he'd try something. Shut up and reload. Woman won't stop screaming. Rhett moved along the wall toward the side door. It was hanging open slightly, and through the gap he could see shadows moving. 2 men at least. Maybe 3. He was outnumbered and exposed and making this up as he went, which was pretty much how most of his jobs ended up going despite the legends people told about him. The side door burst open and a man came through fast, his rifle sweeping the area. Rhett was already moving, stepping inside the man's guard and driving his elbow into the gunman's throat. The rifle went off, deafening in the enclosed space, but the shot went wild. The gunman went down gagging, and Rhett kicked the rifle away before pivoting toward the interior of the station. The main room was bigger than it looked from outside, a wide space that had once been a passenger waiting area, now filled with broken furniture and debris. Martha Bentley was tied to a chair in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. 2 more gunmen were positioned near the front door, both turning toward the sound of the scuffle. Silas stood in the center of the room, holding a pistol that looked too big for his hands. Don't, Rhett said quietly. Silas's hands were shaking. The pistol wavered, pointing at Rhett, then at Martha, then back at Rhett. This isn't how it was supposed to go, Silas said. His voice was breaking. You were supposed to come in helpless, broken. You were supposed to beg. I don't beg. You should learn. One of the gunmen near the door raised his rifle. Rhett shot him before he could complete the motion. Center mass this time, because there was no room left for warning shots. The man went down hard. The second gunman hesitated, which was his mistake. Rhett's gun tracked to him. Drop it, Rhett said. The gunman looked at Silas, at Rhett, at his dead companion. Then he very carefully set his rifle on the floor and raised his hands. Smart, Rhett said. He turned his attention back to Silas. Your play, but if that gun comes up another inch, I'm ending this conversation. Silas's face was twisted with rage and something that looked like grief. You don't understand what you took from me. Your dignity? You threw that away yourself when you chose to cheat desperate men. My identity. Everything I was. You made me a joke. No, Rhett said quietly. I made you face what you already were. That's not the same thing. For a moment, Silas just stood there, the 2 large pistols shaking in his hands, his whole body trembling with years of pent-up fury that had nowhere left to go. Then he turned the gun toward Martha. Rhett fired. The bullet took Silas in the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending the pistol flying. He went down screaming, clutching at the wound, and Rhett was already moving toward Martha, cutting the ropes binding her to the chair with the knife from his boot. You're okay, he told her. You're going home. Martha was crying, shaking, but she nodded. She tried to stand and her legs gave out. Rhett caught her, holding her steady while she found her balance. Behind them, Silas was still screaming, not in pain now, but in rage and the sound of a man whose entire reason for existing had just collapsed. 5 years, he sobbed. 5 years I planned this, 5 years I prepared, and you just... It was always going to end this way, Rhett said. He didn't look back at Silas. He was focused on Martha, making sure she could walk, checking her for injuries. Revenge doesn't fix humiliation. It just makes you someone else's problem. The remaining gunman was still standing with his hands up, looking like he wanted very badly to be anywhere else. Take your friends and leave, Rhett told him. Get Silas to a doctor, and don't ever come back to this territory. The gunman nodded quickly. He moved to help the man Rhett had shot in the shoulder outside, then came back for Silas. Between the two of them, they got the sobbing con artist to his feet and started dragging him toward the door. "Mercer," Silas gasped. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Rhett said. "It's been over for 5 years. You just didn't know it." They left. Rhett waited until he heard horses riding away, then guided Martha outside into the afternoon sunlight. His mare was still standing where he'd left her, patient and calm, despite the gunfire. "Can you ride?" Rhett asked Martha. She nodded. Her face was pale, her hands still shaking, but there was steel in her eyes now. She'd been terrified, but she hadn't broken. Rhett helped her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The mare shifted under the extra weight, but didn't complain. "Good horse." He'd have to remember to tell Gideon that when they got back. If they got back. Because there was still one problem. Silas had said something earlier that hadn't sat right, about how this was all supposed to work, about how Rhett was supposed to walk in helpless. But the trap had been too obvious. The gunman had been competent, but not overwhelming, and Silas had folded too quickly when things went wrong, like he hadn't really believed his own plan would work, which meant this wasn't the real trap. It was a distraction. Rhett turned the mare south and kicked her into a canter, his mind racing. If Silas wanted to break him, really break him, the way he'd been broken, then threatening a stranger wouldn't do it. Martha Bentley meant nothing to Rhett personally. She was a victim who needed saving, but saving victims was what he did. It wouldn't hurt him to succeed or fail. But there was one thing that would hurt. One person Silas would know about because Rhett had made the mistake of mentioning them 5 years ago during a conversation he barely remembered, talking to a bartender about a job he'd done in Wyoming, protecting a homesteader family from claim jumpers. The Carvers. Daniel Carver, his wife Rebecca, their son Jacob. The family who'd written to him 6 months ago asking for help with a boundary dispute that was turning violent. The family he'd promised to check in on after he finished the job in Black Hollow. The family Silas would have learned about if he'd spent 5 years investigating every aspect of Rhett's life, looking for leverage, looking for the one thing that would destroy the legend. "Hold on," Rhett told Martha, and pushed the mare faster. They rode hard for 3 hours, stopping only twice to rest the horse. Martha didn't complain, didn't ask questions. She just held on and endured, which was probably all she had left in her after the night she'd been through. When Black Hollow finally came into view, the sun was starting to drop behind the western peaks. Rhett slowed the mare to a walk as they entered town, and within seconds people were emerging from buildings, calling out, running toward them. Thomas Bentley reached them first, pulling his wife down from the horse before she was fully stopped, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. "Martha! Oh, thank heaven, Martha!" Gideon was there next, his face showing the same careful relief Rhett had seen before in people who'd learned not to celebrate too quickly. "She all right?" the sheriff asked. "Shaken up. Not hurt." Rhett dismounted stiffly. 12 hours in the saddle would do that to you. "She needs rest. And probably someone to talk to who isn't me." Gideon nodded. He called over one of the town women, an older lady with kind eyes who wrapped a blanket around Martha and started leading her toward the doctor's office, despite Martha's protests that she was fine. Then Gideon turned back to Rhett. "What happened?" "Silas had 4 gunmen waiting at the old rail station. We had a disagreement about how the day should go." "The gunmen?" "1 dead, 3 wounded. They won't be coming back." Rhett paused. "But we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where this wasn't the real plan." Gideon's face hardened. "Explain." So Rhett told him. About the setup being too obvious, about Silas folding too easily, about the feeling in his gut that said something was still wrong, about the Carver family in Wyoming, and the very real possibility that while Rhett was busy rescuing Martha, someone was riding to kill the people he'd actually promised to protect. Gideon listened without interrupting. When Rhett finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "Wyoming's 3 days' ride from here," he said finally. "I know. You'll kill the horse if you try to make it in less. I know that too. But you're going anyway. Wouldn't you?" Gideon looked at him, really looked, like he was seeing past the legend to whatever was underneath. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I would." He turned and called toward the stable. "Cooper, fresh horse, fastest one we've got." While they waited, Gideon pulled Rhett aside. "You did good today," he said quietly. Martha's alive because of you. Martha's alive because Silas wanted her alive. I just interrupted his schedule. Maybe, but you still brought her back. Gideon hesitated. Look, I don't know you. Don't know if the stories about you are true or exaggerated or complete fabrications. But I know what you did for this town today, and that counts for something. Don't make me out to be a hero, Sheriff. I'm just trying to fix a mistake. What mistake? Not killing Silas Boone 5 years ago when I had the chance. The words hung heavy between them. Before Gideon could respond, Cooper appeared leading a big roan gelding that looked like it had racing blood in its lineage. He's fast, Cooper said. Got some stamina, too, if you don't push him too hard too early. Rhett took the reins. His legs were already screaming at the thought of 3 more days in the saddle, but that didn't matter. What mattered was getting to Wyoming before someone else died because he'd been too busy playing into Silas's hands. He swung into the saddle, then looked down at Gideon one more time. If I don't make it, you'll make it, Gideon interrupted. But if I don't, tell the Carvers I'm sorry. Tell them I tried. Tell them yourself. Rhett almost smiled. Then he turned the roan toward the setting sun and rode out of Black Hollow for the second time that day. Behind him, Thomas Bentley was still holding his wife like she was the most precious thing in the world. And somewhere ahead of him, a family was waiting for help that might arrive too late. The horse ate up the miles with long, ground-covering strides. Darkness fell, but Rhett kept riding. He knew this country, knew the trails well enough to navigate by starlight and memory. The moon rose late, full and bright, turning the landscape into something ghostly and beautiful and completely indifferent to whether he lived or died. 3 days to Wyoming. He had to make it in 2. The roan started limping 40 miles outside of Casper. Rhett felt it before he saw it, a subtle hitch in the rhythm of the horse's gait, barely noticeable at first, but growing more pronounced with each stride. He pulled up immediately, dismounting to check the legs, even though he already knew what he'd find. Front left hoof. A stone bruise, maybe, or the beginning of an abscess. Nothing life-threatening for the horse, but enough to slow them down significantly if he kept pushing. "Damn it!" Rhett muttered. He ran his hand down the leg, feeling for heat, for swelling. The roan nickered softly and shifted its weight, favoring the injured hoof. They'd been riding for 18 hours straight with only brief stops to water the horse and rest for 10 minutes at a time. Rhett's back felt like someone had been beating it with hammers. His legs were numb from the knees down, and his eyes kept trying to close on their own despite the urgency screaming through his blood. But the horse couldn't help being hurt, and riding it lame would only make things worse. Rhett looked around. Dawn was breaking over flat grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. No towns visible, no ranches, nothing but empty country, and the distant mountains to the west marking the spine of the continent. He was maybe 6 hours from the Carver homestead. 6 hours that might as well be 6 days if he was on foot. The roan nudged his shoulder, looking for attention, or maybe just acknowledging that they'd both had a rough night. Rhett stroked the horse's neck absently while his mind worked through options. He could walk, lead the horse slow and easy, let it recover enough to maybe carry him the last few miles. But that would add hours to the journey, and hours were something he didn't have. He could leave the horse here, hope someone found it before predators did, and run. He'd done forced marches before, knew he could cover ground on foot if he had to, but 6 hours of running in boots that weren't made for it would destroy his feet, and he'd arrive at the Carver place in no shape to fight if fighting was what needed to happen. Or he could find another horse. The sun was fully up now, painting the grassland gold and making everything look peaceful and empty. But Rhett had spent enough time in this territory to know that empty was an illusion. There were ranches out here, homesteads, line shacks used by cowboys during the grazing season. Somewhere within a few miles there would be people, and people meant horses. He just had to find them before he ran out of time. Rhett started walking, leading the roan at an easy pace that kept weight off the injured hoof. The morning was cold enough that his breath fogged, and his duster wasn't quite heavy enough to cut the wind that came whipping across the grassland like it was trying to scrape everything flat. 20 minutes later, he saw smoke. Not much, just a thin gray line rising from behind a low ridge about a mile to the south. Could be a campfire, could be a chimney. Either way, it meant people, and people meant the possibility of help, or the possibility of trouble, depending on who they were and how they felt about strangers showing up at dawn asking for horses. Rhett altered his course toward the smoke, moving as fast as the roan could manage without aggravating its injury. As he crested the ridge, he saw what he'd been hoping for: a small homestead tucked into a creek bottom, protected from the wind by the terrain. One cabin, a barn, a corral, with half a dozen horses milling around, and two men standing in the yard having what looked like a heated discussion. Rhett stopped at the top of the ridge, studying the scene. The men were both young, maybe early 20s, dressed in working clothes. Brothers probably, based on their similar builds and the way they stood. One of them was gesturing angrily toward the barn, while the other had his arms crossed in the universal posture of someone who wasn't backing down. Family argument. Rhett had interrupted enough of those to recognize the signs. He led the roan down the slope slowly, making enough noise that the men would hear him coming and not think he was trying to sneak up on them. Both men turned toward him as he approached, their argument forgotten, hands drifting toward the guns on their hips. Rhett stopped 30 feet away and raised his free hand in a gesture of peace. "Morning," he called. "Sorry to interrupt. I've got a lame horse and a long way to go. Wondering if you might have a fresh mount I could buy or trade for." The two men looked at each other, then back at Rhett. The taller one, the one who'd been doing the angry gesturing, spoke first. "You're on private land." "I know. That's why I'm asking politely instead of just taking what I need." The shorter brother's hand stayed near his gun. "That a threat?" "It's a statement of fact." Rhett kept his voice calm, his posture non-threatening. "I don't want trouble. I just need a horse. I can pay fair price, or I can leave this roan as collateral and come back for it in a week once I finish my business." "What business?" the tall one asked. "The kind that's got nothing to do with you. Maybe we want to know before we help some drifter who shows up at dawn looking half dead." Rhett was silent for a moment, weighing how much to say. These men didn't know him, didn't owe him anything, but they also didn't seem immediately hostile, just cautious, which was reasonable when a stranger appeared on your property asking for things. "There's a family south of here," Rhett said finally. "The Carvers. I promised them help with a problem, and I'm trying to get there before someone else does. Someone who means them harm." "The Carvers?" The shorter brother's expression shifted slightly. "Daniel Carver? You know them?" "Everybody knows them. Daniel helped us rebuild our barn last summer after a storm took the roof off. Good people." The man's hand moved away from his gun. "What kind of trouble are they in?" "The kind I'm trying to prevent." The two brothers looked at each other again, having one of those wordless conversations that siblings could have after growing up together. Then the tall one nodded toward the corral. "Take the bay mare. She's quick and doesn't tire easy. But if Daniel Carver's in trouble, we're coming with you." "I don't need—" "Wasn't asking permission," the tall brother interrupted. "Daniel's a good man. If someone's threatening him, that's our business too. This is our territory." Rhett wanted to argue, wanted to say that bringing civilians into a potentially deadly situation was a terrible idea, that they'd just get in the way or get hurt, or both. But he also knew the look on their faces, the same stubborn determination he'd seen on Gideon Vale's face back in Black Hollow. The look of men who'd decided something was worth fighting for and wouldn't be talked out of it. "Can you shoot?" he asked instead. "Well enough. Can you follow orders?" "Depends on the orders." "Then here's the only one that matters. If things go bad, you protect the Carver family. Not me. I can handle myself. Your job is making sure Daniel, Rebecca, and their boy Jacob get out alive. Everything else is secondary." The tall brother stuck out his hand. "Name's William. This is my brother Peter. And yeah, we can do that." Rhett shook his hand, then Peter's. "Rhett Mercer." Both brothers went very still. "The Rhett Mercer?" Peter asked. "There's only one." "Hell," William said softly. "If you're worried about the Carvers, then they're in real trouble. Which is why we're wasting time talking instead of riding. That got them moving." While Rhett transferred his saddle to the bay mare, William and Peter saddled their own horses, a matched pair of chestnuts that looked like they'd been bred for endurance rather than speed. They moved with the efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times, and within 10 minutes all three of them were mounted and ready to go. "How far?" William asked. 6 hours at a steady pace, 4 if we push." "Then let's push." They rode hard across country, cutting across open grassland and dry creek beds, navigating by landmarks and instinct rather than following trails. The bay mare was everything William had promised. Quick, responsive, with a ground-eating trot that covered distance without exhausting herself. Peter and William kept up without complaint, their chestnuts matching the bay's pace stride for stride. They didn't talk much, which Rhett appreciated. Talking took energy that was better spent staying alert, watching the horizon for riders, for dust clouds, for any sign that they weren't alone out here. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose from cold to merely cool. Rhett's body was operating on something beyond exhaustion now, some kind of reserve fuel that would keep him functional until the crisis passed, at which point he'd probably collapse and sleep for a day straight. But that was a problem for later. Around noon, they stopped briefly to rest the horses. Peter pulled out jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and offered it around. Rhett ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind already hours ahead trying to game out scenarios. If Silas had sent someone to the Carver homestead, it would be one man. Maybe two. Professionals, like the gunmen at the rail station, but not an army. Silas didn't have the resources for an army, and besides, overwhelming force wasn't the point. The point was making Rhett fail, making him arrive too late to save the people he'd promised to protect, which meant the attack would be designed to look like a robbery gone wrong, or a boundary dispute that had escalated, or some other plausible frontier violence that wouldn't immediately point back to Silas. Unless Silas wanted it to be obvious. Unless the whole point was for Rhett to arrive and find bodies, and a message making it clear who was responsible and why. Rhett forced himself to stop speculating. Too many variables, too many possibilities. Better to arrive prepared for anything than to commit to a specific plan that would fall apart the moment reality intervened. "How much further?" William asked, finishing his jerky. 3 hours, maybe less. "Tell us about the Carvers, what we're riding into." So Rhett told them about how Daniel Carver had staked a claim 5 years ago on good land with water access, how he'd built it up from nothing into a working ranch, about the neighbor to the east who'd decided he wanted that water access for himself, and had been making increasingly aggressive moves to force Daniel off his land, about how Daniel had written to Rhett 6 months ago asking for help, not because he couldn't fight, but because he had a wife and son to protect and didn't want to turn his home into a war zone. 6 months ago? Peter frowned. "Why'd you wait so long to come help?" "I was working another job. Sent word I'd be there as soon as I could." Rhett's jaw tightened. Didn't know someone would use that promise to set a trap. They rode on. The grassland gave way to rolling hills marked with scrub pine and juniper. The terrain was getting rougher, more broken, the kind of country where you could hide an army if you knew what you were doing, or hide a single shooter waiting for the right target. Rhett's hand drifted to his gun without conscious thought, checking it was secure, that the action was clear. Old habits, the kind that kept you alive when things went sideways. Around 3 in the afternoon, they crested a rise, and Rhett saw the Carver homestead in the valley below. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. A well-built cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn in good repair, corrals with cattle grazing nearby. The kind of place that represented everything people came west to build. Independence, security, a life carved out of hard work and determination. But something was wrong. Rhett couldn't put his finger on it at first. The scene looked normal enough, but his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right, that they were either too late or arriving at exactly the wrong moment. Then he saw the horses. 3 of them, tied to the corral fence near the cabin. Not the Carver's horses. These were different, bigger, the kind of animals that cost real money. And they were saddled, like their riders planned to leave in a hurry. "There," Rhett said quietly, pointing. William and Peter saw them too. Both brothers reached for their rifles without being told. "What's the play?" William asked. Rhett was already urging the bay down the slope, not at a run, but not slow either. Fast enough to close distance, controlled enough to stay ready for whatever was about to happen. "We find out who those horses belong to," he said, "and we make sure the Carvers are still breathing." They were 100 yards from the cabin when the door opened. A man emerged, tall, thin, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors for a living. He was carrying a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground, not up and ready. Behind him, Rhett could see 2 more figures in the doorway, silhouetted against the interior lamplight. The man with the rifle stopped when he saw Rhett and the brothers approaching. He didn't raise the weapon, but his posture shifted into something more alert, more ready. Rhett reined in 20 feet from the porch, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. "Daniel Carver?" he called. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "Rhett Mercer. You wrote me 6 months ago about a neighbor problem." Recognition flashed across Daniel's face, followed immediately by something that looked like relief and fear in equal measure. "You're late," Daniel said. "I know, had some complications." Rhett dismounted slowly, keeping his attention split between Daniel and the two figures still standing in the doorway. "Those your horses at the corral?" "No." "Who do they belong to?" "Men inside who say they're here to help. Showed up about 2 hours ago." Every muscle in Rhett's body went tense. "How many?" "3. "Armed?" "Yes." "Did they give names?" Daniel shook his head. "Just said they were passing through, saw smoke, thought they'd stop and be neighborly. But something about them doesn't sit right." "Your instincts are good." Rhett turned to William and Peter. "Stay with the horses. Anyone comes out that door who isn't Daniel or his family, you stop them. Don't kill unless you have to, but don't let them ride away." "What are you going to do?" Peter asked. "What I should have done 5 years ago." Rhett walked toward the cabin, his hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. Daniel moved aside to let him pass, but his expression was wary. "Mercer, I don't know what this is about, but Rebecca and Jacob are inside." "I know. That's why I'm going in." The interior of the cabin was warm and well lit, the kind of space that spoke of a woman's touch. Curtains on the windows, a rug on the floor, the smell of something cooking on the stove. Rebecca Carver was standing near the fireplace, her face pale but composed, one hand resting on her son's shoulder. Jacob was maybe 10 years old, thin and serious-looking, the kind of kid who'd learned early that life was hard and you didn't complain about it. 3 men were seated at the table. They looked up when Rhett entered, and he recognized the type immediately. Professional guns for hire, the kind who'd kill you for money and sleep fine afterward. They weren't pointing weapons at anyone, weren't making overt threats, but their presence in the cabin was threat enough. The man in the middle was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too much violence to be impressed by more of it. He smiled when he saw Rhett. "Well," he said, "wondered when you'd show up." "You've been waiting for me." "That's what we were paid for. Watch the Carver place. Make sure nobody leaves. Wait for the famous Rhett Mercer to ride in thinking he's saving the day." The man's smile widened. "You're predictable, Mercer. That's going to get you killed eventually." "Today?" "Maybe. Depends on how smart you are." Rhett looked at Rebecca and Jacob, checking them for injuries. They looked scared but unharmed. That was good. It meant these men had been professional enough to follow their orders without adding unnecessary violence, which meant they might be professional enough to accept a better offer. "How much is Silas paying you?" Rhett asked. The gray-haired man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Straight to negotiation. I like that. Shows you understand how this works." "How much?" $500 each. $1,500 total. That was real money for a job like this. More than Rhett had expected Silas to be able to put together, which meant either the con artist had been more successful than Rhett realized, or he'd borrowed from people who'd expect to be paid back with interest. "I'll give you $2,000, Rhett said. "Total, not each. You walk away now, leave the Carvers alone, and never come back to this territory." "Counteroffer," the gray-haired man said. "We kill you, collect from Silas, and keep the Carvers alive as a professional courtesy since we've got nothing personal against them." "You could try that. We could succeed." "How many men have you lost testing theories like that?" The gray-haired man's smile faded slightly. Behind him, his 2 companions were shifting in their seats, hands moving closer to their weapons. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Rebecca pulled Jacob closer, her knuckles white where she gripped his shoulder. Daniel had moved back inside and was standing near the door with his rifle, looking like he wanted to do something but wasn't sure what. "Let's say I believe you could take all 3 of us," the gray-haired man said slowly. "Let's say you're actually as fast as the stories claim. You'd still take at least 1 bullet doing it, maybe more. And then what? You bleed out on this nice woman's floor while she explains to her son why violence always ends in more violence. Or you take my offer," Rhett said. $2,000 for walking away. No blood. No bodies. No having to explain to Silas why you failed. Silas will be angry. Silas is always angry. That's his problem, not yours. The gray-haired man leaned back in his chair, studying Rhett's face like he was trying to read something written there. Behind him, one of his companions was getting antsy, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. Problem is, the gray-haired man said finally, a deal with you is only good if you survive to pay it. And Silas has other people in motion, people you don't know about, people who are heading to other places you care about. He paused. You ever heard of a town called Red Creek? Every drop of blood in Rhett's body went cold. Red Creek was where his sister lived, his only surviving family, a seamstress who'd left the frontier life behind years ago to build something quiet and safe in a small mountain town where nobody knew who her brother was or what he did for a living. He doesn't know about Red Creek, Rhett said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. If Silas had spent 5 years investigating him, he'd have found Sarah eventually, would have learned she existed, where she lived, how much she meant to Rhett. The gray-haired man saw the realization on Rhett's face and nodded slowly. Now you understand. This isn't just about the Carvers. This is about making you choose. Save them, and your sister dies. Ride to Red Creek, and the family who trusted you gets killed. Either way, you fail. He stood up from the table. Silas doesn't want you dead, Mercer. He wants you broken. Wants you to live with the knowledge that you couldn't save everyone. That for all your skill and reputation, you're just as helpless as he was when you humiliated him in Laramie. How long? Rhett's voice was barely above a whisper. How long what? How long until whoever he sent reaches Red Creek? They left yesterday. So, maybe another day? Day and a half? The gray-haired man smiled again, but this time there was something almost sympathetic in it. You could ride hard, make it in time, but then we'd have to kill the Carvers. Those are our orders. Rhett stood perfectly still, his mind racing through possibilities and finding nothing but impossible choices. He couldn't be in two places at once, couldn't save both the Carvers and Sarah. Whichever direction he chose, people would die, and Silas would have won. Unless... Daniel, Rhett said without taking his eyes off the gray-haired man. How good a shot are you? Good enough. Good enough to hit a man at this distance without hitting his friends? In this light? Yeah, I think so. The gray-haired man's smile disappeared. Now, wait just a... Rebecca, Rhett continued, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. When I move, you grab Jacob and get behind the stove. It's iron. It'll stop bullets. Mercer, the gray-haired man started. You had your chance to take the money, Rhett said. Now I'm giving you one last chance to walk out of here alive. You and your men leave, right now. Get on your horses and ride away. Tell Silas I'm coming for him, and when I find him it won't be quick. And if we don't? Then you die trying to collect $500 that isn't worth dying for. For a long moment, nobody moved. The three gunmen were looking at each other, doing the mental math, weighing odds and options. Outside, Rhett could hear the horses shifting in the corral, could hear William and Peter's voices murmuring to each other as they maintained their positions. Then one of the gray-haired man's companions stood up fast, his hand going for his gun. Rhett moved. Everything happened in the space between heartbeats. Rhett's gun cleared leather as he was already diving sideways, getting out of the line of fire. Daniel's rifle boomed, deafening in the enclosed space. Rebecca screamed and pulled Jacob behind the stove, just as the shooting started in earnest. The gray-haired man was fast, faster than Rhett had expected, his pistol coming up and firing twice before Rhett even hit the ground. One bullet punched through the space where Rhett's head had been a second earlier. The other buried itself in the wall near the door. Rhett fired from the floor, his first shot taking the man who'd stood up fast in the chest. The gunman went down hard, his own weapon discharging into the ceiling. Daniel's rifle boomed again, and the third man jerked backward as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. That left the gray-haired man. He was diving behind the table, using it for cover, his gun tracking toward Rhett. But Rhett was already rolling, already moving, his second shot shattering the lamp on the table and plunging half the room into darkness. "Stop!" the gray-haired man shouted. "Stop! I yield!" Rhett came to his feet with his gun pointed at where the voice had come from. "Throw out your weapon." A pistol skidded across the floor. Rhett kicked it away without looking, his attention fixed on the overturned table and the shadow behind it. Stand up, slowly. The gray-haired man emerged with his hands raised, his face pale in the dim light from the remaining lamp. Behind him, one of his companions was dead, and the other was moaning and clutching his shoulder. Daniel had moved to cover them both with his rifle, his face grim but steady. You made a mistake, Rhett told the gray-haired man. Several, apparently. No, just one. You told me about Red Creek. That was what I was supposed to do, part of making you choose. But now I don't have to choose. Rhett's voice was cold. Now I know where Silas is going, because if he sent men to Red Creek, that means he's not there yet, which means he's still traveling, which means I can catch him. The gray-haired man's face went even paler as he realized what he'd revealed. And you, Rhett continued, are going to tell me exactly where he is and where he's going. And if you tell me the truth, I'll let you live. But if you lie to me, if you try to buy him time, I'll shoot you in both knees and leave you here to bleed while I ride after him anyway. I don't know where... Rhett's gun moved slightly, aiming lower. He's going north, the gray-haired man blurted. Toward the Bitterroot Pass. Said he wanted to watch from a distance when Red Creek burned. Wanted to see your face when you realized you were too late. When does it burn? Tomorrow night, maybe the night after. The men he sent were supposed to wait for dark. Make it look like an accident. Rhett holstered his gun and turned to Daniel. You and your family need to leave. Tonight. Go to your neighbor's place, the one who's been causing problems. Tell him Rhett Mercer says if he bothers you again, I'll come back and we'll have a different kind of conversation. Then go to town. Stay with friends. Don't come back here for a week. What about them? Daniel gestured toward the gunman. He's leaving with me. Rhett looked at the gray-haired man. You're going to take me to Silas. And if he's not where you say he'll be, I'm going to assume you lied, and we'll revisit that conversation about your knees. And them? Daniel asked, indicating the wounded man and the corpse. Bury the dead one. The wounded one goes to a doctor. Neither of them is your problem anymore. Rebecca had emerged from behind the stove, still holding Jacob. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Don't thank me yet. Just get your family somewhere safe. He didn't wait for a response. He walked outside where William and Peter were standing with their rifles ready, having heard the shooting but held their positions like he'd told them to. It's done, Rhett said. The Carvers need help packing. Can you stay with them until they're safe? What about you? William asked. I'm going north. To find Silas? To end this. Peter looked at the gray-haired man who'd emerged from the cabin with his hands still raised. You're taking him? He's going to show me the way. And if he doesn't? Rhett didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything about what would happen if the gray-haired man decided to be uncooperative. 20 minutes later, Rhett was back on the bay mare with the gray-haired gunman riding beside him on one of the horses from the corral. William and Peter were helping the Carvers pack, and Daniel was already writing a note to his troublesome neighbor explaining exactly how things were going to be from now on. Which way? Rhett asked. The gray-haired man pointed north. Bitterroot Pass, 3 days' ride if you take the main trail. 2 if you know the shortcuts. Show me the shortcuts. They rode north into the fading afternoon light. Behind them, the Carver homestead grew smaller until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the immensity of the frontier that stretched in every direction without mercy or care. Rhett didn't look back. He was done looking back. It was time to finish what he should have finished 5 years ago in Laramie. The shortcuts turned out to be game trails and old mining roads that cut through country most people avoided, steep ravines choked with deadfall, creek crossings where one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling into freezing water, stretches of loose shale that could break a horse's leg if you weren't careful. The gray-haired gunman, who'd finally given his name as Mitchell, knew the routes well enough to make Rhett wonder how many times he'd used them to avoid the law or honest people who might ask inconvenient questions. They rode through the night, stopping only when the horses absolutely needed rest. Mitchell didn't try to run, didn't try to mislead them onto false trails or into ambushes. He just rode and gave directions and kept his mouth shut except when Rhett asked him direct questions. Around midnight, they stopped in a pine grove to let the horses drink from a spring. Rhett's eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand, and every muscle in his body was screaming for rest. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford, Not with his sister's life hanging in the balance and Silas somewhere ahead planning whatever final piece of revenge he'd spent 5 years building toward. Mitchell sat down heavily on a fallen log and pulled out a flask. He took a long drink, then offered it to Rhett. "No," Rhett said. "Suit yourself." Mitchell took another drink and capped the flask. "You know this isn't going to end the way you think." "How do you figure?" "Because Silas isn't stupid. He knew you'd figure out Red Creek eventually. Probably wanted you to. The whole point is making you run around trying to save everyone while he stays 3 steps ahead laughing at you. Then he miscalculated." "Did he?" Mitchell leaned back against a tree, his face shadowed in the moonlight. "You've been riding for what, 3 days now? 4? You're exhausted, running on fumes. Meanwhile, Silas is rested, prepared, probably sitting in some comfortable spot watching all his pieces move exactly where he wants them. You sound like you admire him." "I admire anyone who can plan this far ahead. Most people can barely see past tomorrow." Mitchell shook his head. "He really got under your skin, didn't he? That night in Laramie, the way you humiliated him in front of everyone. He was stealing from people who couldn't afford to lose, and you were the righteous avenger who put him in his place. Made yourself feel good. Made the crowd cheer, made everything right with the world." Mitchell's voice was bitter. "You ever stop to think about what you were really doing? You weren't just stopping a card cheat. You were destroying a man's entire identity in front of everyone who'd ever known him. His identity was built on lies. So is yours." The words hung in this cold air between them. Rhett stood perfectly still, his hand resting on his gun, his eyes locked on Mitchell's face. "Explain that," Rhett said quietly. "The great Rhett Mercer, the legend, the man who never fails, who always gets his target, who brings justice to the lawless frontier." Mitchell laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "You think that's real? That's a story you tell yourself, a character you play. And everyone believes it because you've gotten real good at the performance." "I do what I do." "Yeah, you do, and sometimes people die because of it. Sometimes the men you hunt down had families who depended on them. Sometimes the justice you deliver is just revenge wearing a nicer coat." Mitchell stood up slowly. "I'm not saying Silas is right, but I understand why he hates you so much. Because you broke his mask and showed everyone what was underneath. And now he's trying to do the same to you." Rhett wanted to argue, wanted to say Mitchell was wrong, that there was a difference between stopping criminals and whatever game Silas was playing. But he was too tired to fight about philosophy with a hired gun who probably didn't believe half of what he was saying anyway. "How much further?" Rhett asked instead. "Another day, maybe less if we keep this pace." "Then let's stop wasting time talking." They mounted up and rode on. The moon set and the stars wheeled overhead, and the darkness pressed in from all sides like something physical. Rhett's mind kept drifting, kept trying to shut down and drag him into sleep, but he forced himself to stay alert, to watch Mitchell for any sign of betrayal, to scan their surroundings for threats. He thought about Sarah, his sister, who'd left the violence of the frontier behind because she was smarter than him, smarter than their parents who'd died trying to carve out a life in country that didn't care whether they lived or failed. She'd built something good in Red Creek, a small dressmaking business, a quiet life, friends who didn't know about her brother's reputation. And now she was in danger because Rhett had made an enemy 5 years ago and been too arrogant to kill him when he had the chance. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, mixing with the exhaustion and the anger until he couldn't tell which feeling was which anymore. They were just fuel for the same fire, the same driving need to reach Silas before anyone else died because of choices Rhett had made. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray before finally surrendering to pale blue. They were in mountain country now, climbing toward the pass that would take them down into the valley, where Red Creek sat nestled between ridges like something fragile that needed protecting. Mitchell pulled up suddenly, raising his hand in a signal to stop. Rhett reined in beside him, instantly alert. "What is it?" "Smoke," Mitchell said, pointing ahead. "See it?" Rhett looked. There, maybe 2 miles distant, a thin column of smoke was rising from behind a rocky outcrop. Too much smoke for a campfire. Not enough for a forest fire. "Building fire?" Rhett asked. "Could be. Or could be Silas signaling his men." Mitchell glanced at Rhett. "He likes to watch. Likes to see his plans play out. If he's up here overlooking the valley, that's probably where he'd make camp." Rhett studied the smoke, calculating distances and angles. If that was Silas, and if Rhett rode straight for him, the men heading to Red Creek would have time to complete their job before Rhett could stop them. But if he rode for the town first, Silas would see him coming and probably escape, which meant this whole chase would start over again somewhere else. Another impossible choice. Another fork in the road where someone was going to get hurt no matter which direction he chose. Unless he was faster than both problems. "How many men does Silas have with him?" Rhett asked. "When I left? 2. Maybe 3. He doesn't trust big groups. Thinks they're harder to control." "And how many did he send to Red Creek?" 4, I think. Maybe 5. Bad odds either way. But Rhett had faced bad odds before and survived by doing the thing nobody expected. He dismounted and started checking his weapons. Both pistols loaded and clean. Rifle secured, knife sharp. Everything he needed to walk into a fight and walk back out, assuming luck and skill broke the right direction. Mitchell watched him work. "What's your plan?" "You're going to Red Creek," Rhett said. "You're going to find the men Silas sent and tell them the job's off. Tell them Mercer's coming, and if they're smart, they'll be gone before he arrives. And if they don't listen, then at least I tried to give them a chance." Rhett swung back into the saddle, which is more than they'd give anyone else. "What about you?" "I'm going after Silas." "Alone? Against 3 men in a defensive position?" Mitchell shook his head. "That's suicide." "Probably, but it's also the only way to make sure this ends today." Rhett looked at Mitchell hard. "You do this. You warn those men, you help them get out before blood gets spilled, and I'll consider your debt paid. You'll walk away from this with your life and whatever conscience you've got left intact." "And if I don't? If I just ride away and leave you to sort this out yourself? Then eventually I'll find you, and we'll have a conversation about keeping promises." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Red Creek's 3 miles north down the main trail. Can't miss it." "I know where it is." "Mercer?" Mitchell's voice stopped him as he started to turn away. "For what it's worth, I hope you make it. You're a self-righteous bastard, but you're honest about it. That counts for something." "Save it," Rhett said. "Just do what I asked." He watched Mitchell ride north toward Red Creek, waiting until the man was out of sight before turning his attention to the smoke still rising from behind the rocky outcrop. His heart was hammering in his chest now, adrenaline starting to override the exhaustion that had been dragging at him for days. This was it, the endgame. Whatever Silas had been building toward for 5 years was about to come crashing down, one way or another. Rhett urged the bay forward at a walk, keeping to the tree line, approaching from an angle where the rocks would screen him from view. The smoke was definitely coming from a camp. He could smell it now, wood smoke and something else. Coffee, maybe. Men who were comfortable enough to make coffee weren't expecting trouble. That was good. It meant Silas thought his plan was still working, that Rhett was still running around trying to save everyone while the real trap stayed hidden. Time to show him how wrong he was. Rhett left the bay tied to a tree 50 yards from the outcrop and continued on foot, moving slow and quiet through the underbrush. The morning was warming up, birds starting to sing, the world going about its business completely indifferent to the violence about to unfold. He could hear voices now, low conversation, the clink of metal on metal. At least 2 men, maybe 3, like Mitchell had said. Rhett found a position behind a boulder that gave him a sightline into the camp. What he saw made his jaw tighten. 3 men were sitting around a small fire, drinking coffee and talking. 2 of them looked like hired muscle, competent but not exceptional. The third was Silas Boone. He'd changed in 5 years. Lost weight, gained lines around his eyes and mouth that made him look older than he should. But the biggest change was in his posture, in the way he held himself. The soft con artist who'd run from Laramie was gone. This version sat straight-backed and alert, a rifle across his knees, scanning the horizon like he expected company. Which he did, just not from this direction. Rhett watched them for a full minute, marking positions, checking for weapons, looking for anything that might complicate what he was about to do. Behind the 3 men was a makeshift shelter, canvas stretched between trees. Beside the fire were saddlebags and supplies, and on a flat rock next to Silas was a pair of binoculars pointed toward the valley where Red Creek sat invisible in the distance. Waiting. Watching, planning to enjoy the show when the town started burning. Rhett stood up and stepped into view. All three men froze. One of the hired guns went for his weapon, but Rhett's voice stopped him cold. "Don't!" The man's hand hovered over his pistol, caught between survival instinct and training. "Move away from the gun," Rhett said quietly. "Both of you, stand up slow and move away from your weapons." The two hired guns looked at Silas, waiting for orders. But Silas just sat there with the rifle across his knees, staring at Rhett like he was seeing a ghost. "You're supposed to be in Red Creek," Silas said finally. "Change of plans." "How did you—" Silas's eyes widened. "Mitchell, that bastard talked." "Mitchell's smarter than the rest of you. He figured out which side of this he wanted to be on before it was too late." One of the hired guns shifted his weight slightly. Rhett's gun tracked to him immediately. "I said don't move." The man froze again. "Here's how this works," Rhett said. "You two are going to stand up, get on your horses, and ride away. You're fired. Whatever Silas is paying you isn't enough to die for, and if you're still here in 60 seconds, dying is exactly what's going to happen." "Stay where you are," Silas snapped. "I'm paying you to—" "You're paying us to watch," one of the hired guns interrupted. He was already standing, already moving away from the fire. "You didn't say nothing about fighting Rhett Mercer. That costs extra." "I'll double your fee." "Not interested." The man jerked his head at his companion. "Let's go." The second hired gun hesitated for just a moment, looking between Silas and Rhett. Then he stood up and followed his friend toward the horses tied behind the shelter. Within 2 minutes, both men were mounted and riding away. Not fast, but not slow either, just steady and purposeful, like men who'd made a smart decision and weren't looking back. That left Silas alone with his rifle and his binoculars and 5 years of hatred that had nowhere left to go. "So," Silas said. His voice was steady, but his hands were white-knuckled on the rifle. "This is how it ends." "This is how it ends," Rhett agreed. "You could have killed me in Laramie. Should have killed me." "Yeah, I should have." "Why didn't you?" It was the same question Rhett had been asking himself for 5 years. The same question that had haunted him through every mile of this chase, every moment of this trap that Silas had spent so long building. "Because I thought you were harmless," Rhett said finally. "Just a con artist, not worth the bullet. And now? Now I know I was wrong." Silas laughed, but it was a broken sound. 5 years. 5 years I spent planning this, learning everything about you, finding your weaknesses, the people you cared about, the promises you made. He shook his head. "I was going to destroy you, Mercer. Destroy the legend. Show everyone that the great Rhett Mercer was just a man who couldn't save everyone no matter how hard he tried. You failed." "Did I?" Silas's eyes were wild now. "Look at you. You've been running for days, exhausted, desperate, watching your careful reputation crumble as you realize you can't be everywhere at once, can't save everyone who needs saving." He leaned forward. "How does it feel, Mercer? How does it feel to be helpless?" "It feels like I should have done this 5 years ago." Rhett moved, not toward Silas, but sideways, getting out of the direct line of fire while his hand dropped toward his gun. Silas brought the rifle up fast, faster than Rhett expected, his finger already on the trigger. The rifle boomed. Rhett felt the bullet pass close enough to feel the wind of it, close enough that if he'd been a half-second slower, it would have taken his head off. He rolled behind the boulder he'd been using for cover, his own gun now drawn and ready. "You're fast," Silas called out, "but not fast enough to close the distance before I shoot you." "Don't have to close the distance," Rhett called back. "Just have to wait until you run out of ammunition. I've got plenty of ammunition." "But you don't have plenty of skill. You're not a gunfighter, Silas. You're a con artist playing at being dangerous. I'm dangerous enough to have gotten you here. You got me here by hurting innocent people. That's not dangerous. That's just cruel." Silence. Then Silas's voice came again, quieter now. "You destroyed my life." "No," Rhett said. "I exposed what your life already was. There's a difference." "There's no difference. I was someone before you came along. I had respect. People feared me. People feared losing their money to a card cheat. That's not respect." Another shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the boulder inches from where Rhett was crouched. He could hear Silas breathing hard now, could hear the desperation in the uneven rhythm. I spent 5 years rebuilding myself, Silas shouted. 5 years becoming someone who could face you, someone who could beat you at your own game. You didn't rebuild yourself, Rhett called back. You just found new ways to hurt people. That's not growth. That's just becoming more of what you already were. Shut up! The men at the rail station, Martha Bentley, the Carvers, my sister, all of them just pawns in your revenge fantasy. None of them did anything to you, but you were willing to kill them anyway, just to make me feel what you felt. Yes, Silas's voice cracked. Yes, I wanted you to know, wanted you to understand what it's like when everything you are gets stripped away in front of everyone. But here's the thing, Silas. Rhett shifted position, getting ready to move. You're not stripping away anything. You're just proving that I was right about you 5 years ago. You're not dangerous. You're just sad. The words hit harder than any bullet could have. Rhett heard Silas make a sound that might have been a sob or a scream or both. Then Silas stood up from behind the fire, the rifle coming up for one final shot. Rhett was already moving, already clear of the boulder, his gun coming up smooth and practiced. They fired at the same instant. Silas's shot went wide, kicked off by the recoil and his shaking hands and the fact that he'd never really learned to shoot under pressure. Rhett's didn't. The bullet took Silas in the chest, dead center, exactly where Rhett had aimed. The rifle fell from Silas's hands and he staggered backward 2 steps before his legs gave out and he collapsed beside his own campfire. Rhett walked over slowly, his gun still drawn, watching for any sign that this was another trick, another layer to the trap. But there was no trick. Silas lay on his back, staring up at the morning sky, breathing in short, gasping pulls, blood spreading across his chest in a dark stain. I almost had you, Silas whispered. Rhett knelt beside him. No, you never had me. You just convinced yourself you did. The town, Red Creek, they'll still... Mitchell's warning them off right now. Your men will be gone before anything happens. Rhett paused. It's over, Silas. All of it. Silas's eyes found Rhett's face. For just a moment, the hatred faded, and what was left looked almost human. Almost like the man he might have been if he'd made different choices 5 years ago. I could have been someone, Silas said. You were someone. Just not someone worth becoming. That's cruel. It's honest. Silas tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that brought blood to his lips. Honesty. From Rhett Mercer. Imagine that. His breathing was getting shallower now, the spaces between breaths growing longer. Rhett stayed beside him, watching the life fade from a man who'd wasted 5 years of it on revenge that had accomplished nothing except proving the exact thing he'd been trying to disprove. Any last words? Rhett asked quietly. Silas's eyes were losing focus, staring at something beyond the sky, beyond the mountains, beyond whatever came after all of this. I should have walked away, he whispered. That night, in Laramie, should have just walked away. Yeah, Rhett said. You should have. Silas took one more breath. Then his eyes went glassy and still, and the man who'd spent 5 years building a trap finally fell into it himself. Rhett stood up slowly, holstering his gun. His hands were steady. They'd been steady through the whole thing, through days of riding and fighting and impossible choices. But now, standing over the body of a man he'd killed because he hadn't killed him 5 years earlier, Rhett felt something crack in his chest. Not regret, exactly. Silas had made his choices and earned his ending. But something close to it, something that felt like recognition that this whole mess could have been avoided if Rhett had been willing to do the hard thing instead of the merciful thing all those years ago. He gathered up Silas's belongings, the rifle, the binoculars, the saddlebags. Searched through them, looking for anything that might indicate other plots still in motion, other people in danger. Found nothing but money and supplies and a journal filled with obsessive notes about Rhett's movements over the past 5 years. 5 years? 5 years of one man's life consumed by hatred, by the need to destroy someone who'd humiliated him in front of a crowd. What a waste. Rhett left Silas where he'd fallen. The birds and weather would take care of the body, and that seemed appropriate somehow. No marker, no memorial, just a man who'd let revenge consume him until there was nothing left but the ashes of what he might have been. He retrieved his horse and rode north toward Red Creek, following the same trail Mitchell had taken an hour earlier. The sun was fully up now, warm on his back, and the valley ahead looked peaceful and untouched. When he reached the outskirts of Red Creek 2 hours later, he found Mitchell waiting at the edge of town with 4 hard-looking men standing beside their horses, all of them looking like they'd just had a very uncomfortable conversation. They were getting ready to move on the town, Mitchell said when Rhett rode up. I convinced them their employer was dead and the job was canceled. Convinced them how? Told them the truth. Showed them Silas's money that I may have taken from his saddlebags before I left the outcrop. Mitchell shrugged. Figured if the man was dead, the money might as well go to someone who could use it. One of the 4 men stepped forward. He was young, maybe 25, with hard eyes, but something like relief on his face. This true? He asked Rhett. Silas Boone is dead? He's dead. And the job's off? The job was always off. You just didn't know it yet. The young man nodded slowly. Then he turned to his companions. Let's go. They mounted up and rode south without another word. 4 more men who'd gotten lucky enough to walk away from a fight that would have killed most of them. Mitchell watched them go, then turned back to Rhett. What now? Now you ride away too, far away. And you think real hard about what you want to do with the rest of your life, because the next time we meet, I'm going to ask you what you decided. That a threat? It's advice. Rhett paused. You helped today. That counts for something. Don't waste it. Mitchell held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. He swung into his saddle and rode west without looking back. Rhett sat his horse at the edge of Red Creek, looking at the small town that had almost burned because he'd made an enemy 5 years ago and been too merciful to finish what he'd started. Somewhere in there, his sister was going about her day, completely unaware of how close she'd come to dying. That was probably for the best. Some things people were better off not knowing. He turned his horse south and started the long ride back to Black Hollow. The job was done. The trap was sprung. Silas Boone was dead, and the people he'd threatened were safe. But Rhett couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something in the process, some piece of himself that he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the belief that mercy was always the better choice. Maybe it was the certainty that his reputation meant he was doing something worthwhile. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion talking, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd spent 5 days running and fighting and making impossible choices with people's lives hanging in the balance. Either way, the ride south felt longer than the ride north had been. And when Black Hollow finally came into view 3 days later, Rhett wasn't sure what he was riding toward anymore. Just that he was too tired to run from it. The bay mare was limping by the time Black Hollow came into view. Not badly, but enough that Rhett felt guilty for pushing her as hard as he had over 8 days of hell that had taken them from Montana to Wyoming and back again. He'd stop at the livery first, make sure she got proper care before he did anything else. The horse had earned that much. The town looked exactly the same as when he'd left it. Same weathered buildings, same rutted streets, same mountains looming in the background like they were keeping watch over everything below. Nothing had changed, which was somehow both comforting and deeply strange after everything that had happened. Rhett rode in slowly, drawing looks from people on the street who recognized him, who remembered the man who'd ridden out over a week ago to save Martha Bentley. Some of them nodded. A few looked away quickly, like they weren't sure whether acknowledging him was a good idea or a dangerous one. He found Gideon at the train depot, sweeping the platform just like he had been that first morning when 4 riders had delivered a letter that set everything in motion. The sheriff looked up when he heard the horse, set his broom aside, and walked to the edge of the platform. His face showed relief and something else. Maybe concern, maybe just the weariness of a man who'd spent 8 days not knowing whether he'd ever see Rhett Mercer alive again. You look like hell, Gideon said. Feel worse. The Carvers? Safe. Sent them to stay with family until things cooled down. And Silas? Rhett dismounted stiffly, his legs barely holding him upright. Dead. Gideon nodded slowly. He didn't ask for details, didn't press for the story. Just accepted the information the way a man accepts news about weather or crop prices, as a fact that couldn't be changed and didn't require commentary. Your sister? Gideon asked instead. Doesn't even know she was in danger. Mitchell got there in time to call off the attack. Mitchell being one of the men who tried to kill you? Yeah, turns out even hired guns can make smart decisions when properly motivated. Gideon almost smiled at that. Then his expression turned serious again. Town wants to have some kind of celebration. Thank you properly for what you did. Martha's been talking about organizing something at the church, getting everyone together. No, Rhett said. The word came out harsher than he intended. He softened his voice. No celebrations. I didn't do this for recognition. I know, but people need to express gratitude. It's important to them. Then they can express it by leaving me alone. Gideon studied his face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there made him nod again. Fair enough. I'll tell Martha you're too tired for social gatherings. She'll understand. He paused. But you should at least let Doc Harris look at you. You're moving like something's broken. Nothing's broken, just tired. Rhett, I said I'm fine. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Gideon had the good sense not to push, which was one of many reasons he'd survived 12 years as a frontier sheriff when most men in his position ended up dead or drunk or both. Need a place to stay? Gideon asked instead. Hotel's full up with minors, but I've got a spare room at my place. Not much, but it's quiet. Rhett wanted to say no, wanted to get back on the horse and ride somewhere else, somewhere he didn't have to see people looking at him like he was a hero when all he felt was tired and empty and vaguely angry at himself for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. But the horse needed rest, and so did he, whether he wanted to admit it or not. One night, Rhett said. One night, Gideon agreed. He led Rhett to a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a 2-room cabin with a wood stove and furniture that had been built by hand and repaired multiple times. It was clean, though, and quiet, and after 8 days of sleeping on the ground when he slept at all, the narrow bed in the spare room looked like the most luxurious thing Rhett had ever seen. I'll bring food later, Gideon said. You should rest. Rhett nodded. He was already sitting on the bed, pulling off his boots with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion. Gideon left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. The silence that followed was overwhelming. For 8 days, Rhett had been in constant motion, riding, fighting, making decisions that meant life or death for people he had never met. There had been no time to think, no space to process anything beyond the immediate need to survive and keep moving forward. But now, sitting alone in a quiet room with nothing pressing that needed his attention, everything he'd been pushing away came flooding back. Silas's face as he died, the desperation in his eyes, the wasted years, the pointless hatred, Martha Bentley's terror, the Carver's fear, his sister living her life completely unaware of how close she'd come to burning alive because her brother had made enemies, Mitchell's words echoing in his head, the great Rhett Mercer, the legend. That's a story you tell yourself. A character you play. Was that true? Had he spent so long building a reputation that he'd forgotten what was underneath it? Or worse, had there never been anything underneath it to begin with? Rhett lay back on the bed without bothering to undress. The ceiling was rough wood, marked with knots and grain patterns that looked like faces if you stared at them long enough. He stared for a while, too tired to sleep, too exhausted to stay fully awake. Somewhere in that gray space between consciousness and oblivion, he heard footsteps outside. Voices talking quietly. The sounds of Black Hollow going about its evening business. People living their lives, completely unaware that their continued existence had hung by a thread for over a week. That should have felt good. Should have felt like purpose, like meaning, like proof that what he did mattered. Instead, it just felt heavy. When Rhett finally fell asleep, he dreamed of Laramie, of a card game 5 years ago and a choice he'd made to humiliate instead of kill. In the dream, Silas stood up from the table and walked away into darkness. And Rhett knew, the way you know things in dreams, that if he'd just pulled the trigger then, none of this would have happened. But he also knew that pulling the trigger would have changed him into something he didn't want to be. The dream didn't offer any answers about which choice was right. It just showed him both paths stretching into darkness, both of them leading somewhere he couldn't see. He woke to late afternoon sunlight and the smell of food. Gideon had left a plate on the small table near the stove. Bread, cheese, some kind of stew that had gone cold but still smelled edible. Rhett ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind still tangled in the question that had followed him from the dream into waking. What was the right choice? Kill a man who might become dangerous or show mercy and deal with the consequences if you guessed wrong? There was a knock on the door. Rhett tensed instinctively, his hand moving toward his gun before he caught himself. Not everything was a threat. Not every sound meant danger. "Come in," he called. The door opened and Thomas Bentley stepped inside, hat in his hands, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. "Mr. Mercer," Thomas said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You are, but that's fine. What do you need?" Thomas twisted his hat between his hands. "I wanted to thank you, for Martha, for bringing her home." He paused. "She told me what happened, what you did, the risks you took." "I did what anyone would do." "No, you did what you do, and I'm grateful for it." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you. Payment for your services." Rhett looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "I didn't do this for money." "I know, but Martha and I discussed it, and we want you to have this anyway. It's not much, but it's what we can afford, and it feels important to pay our debts properly." "Keep it," Rhett said. "Buy your girls something nice, or save it for winter. I don't need your money, Thomas." "Then what do you need?" The question caught Rhett off guard. He looked at Thomas, this ordinary man with his ordinary life who'd had his wife taken and returned and was trying to do the right thing by offering payment he probably couldn't afford. "I need you to understand something," Rhett said slowly. "What happened to Martha? That was my fault. Silas took her to get to me. If I'd killed him 5 years ago when I had the chance, none of this would have happened. But you didn't kill him. You showed mercy, and Martha suffered for it." "Martha's alive because of you," Thomas said firmly. "Whatever happened before, whatever choices you made or didn't make, the result is that my wife is home safe. That's what matters to me. That's what matters to my daughters." Rhett wanted to argue, wanted to make Thomas understand that the calculus wasn't that simple, that you couldn't just ignore the chain of events that led to someone being in danger in the first place. But Thomas was already backing toward the door, envelope still in his hand, expression showing he'd said what he came to say and wasn't interested in philosophical debates about guilt and responsibility. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," Thomas said, "for everything." He left before Rhett could respond. Rhett sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the space where Thomas had been standing, trying to reconcile the gratitude he'd just received with the guilt still sitting heavy in his chest. The problem, he realized, was that both things were true. He'd saved Martha. He'd also put her in danger. He'd shown mercy to Silas. He'd also created an enemy who'd spent 5 years plotting revenge. He'd built a reputation that allowed him to help people. He'd also built a target on his back that affected everyone around him. There was no clean answer, no simple moral that made everything make sense, just the messy reality that every choice had consequences. And sometimes those consequences hurt innocent people no matter how good your intentions were. The next morning, Rhett found Gideon at the depot again, going through his morning routine like always. "Leaving?" Gideon asked without looking up from his sweeping. "How'd you know?" "You've got that look. The one people get when they've stayed in one place too long and need to move before they start putting down roots." Gideon finally stopped sweeping and turned to face Rhett. "Where to?" "Don't know yet. Somewhere else. Somewhere that isn't here." "Because of what people might say? The gratitude?" "Because staying means answering questions I don't have answers for." Gideon leaned on his broom, studying Rhett with those steady eyes that had seen through 12 years of frontier justice and still somehow believed civilization was worth fighting for. "You did good here," Gideon said. "Despite everything, despite the complications, you saved lives. That counts for something." "Does it? Or did I just delay the inevitable? Someone else will come along eventually. Someone else will threaten this town, threaten the people you care about, and you'll have to deal with it without me here to help." "That's how it's always been. We deal with problems as they come. We survive. We help each other." Gideon paused. "That's what a community is, Mercer. Not one man protecting everyone, but everyone protecting each other." "Then you don't need me." "We never needed you. We're grateful you were here when we needed help, but need and want are different things." Gideon's voice was gentle. "You're not responsible for keeping the entire frontier safe. You're just a man doing what he can with the skills he has. That's enough. It has to be enough." Rhett wanted to believe that, wanted to accept that doing your best was sufficient even when your best couldn't prevent bad things from happening. But acceptance had never been his strong suit. "The Carvers sent word," Gideon said, changing the subject. "They're settling back into their homestead. Daniel said to tell you the neighbor problem resolved itself. Apparently word got around about what happened, and suddenly everyone's real interested in respecting property lines." "Good. Your sister wrote too." Mitchell stopped in Red Creek on his way south, told her some story about bandits that got scared off. She wanted me to pass along that she's fine, and you should stop worrying so much. How did you? I'm a sheriff, Mercer. I ask questions. I piece things together. Gideon smiled slightly. She sounds like a good person, the kind who'd be worth protecting. She is. Then maybe that's your answer. What answer? The one you've been looking for since you rode back into town looking like you'd lost something important. Gideon gestured around at Black Hollow, at the mountains, at the endless frontier stretching in every direction. You can't save everyone, can't prevent every bad thing from happening, but you can protect the people who matter to you, can choose who's worth fighting for. That's not weakness. That's being human. The words settled into Rhett's chest like stones finding the bottom of deep water. Not comfortable exactly, but solid. Something to stand on instead of drowning in questions that had no good answers. I'm still leaving, Rhett said. I know. Today, probably. Your horse is rested. Doc Harris looked her over, said she'll be fine for traveling. You're making it easy to go. Because you need to go, Gideon said simply. Men like you don't do well staying in one place. You need movement, distance, space to think without people looking at you like you're something you're not. He extended his hand. But you're welcome back any time. Black Hollow doesn't forget its friends. Rhett shook his hand. Gideon's grip was firm, calloused from 12 years of hard work and harder choices. You're good at this, Rhett said. At what? Being the backbone, the thing that holds everything together. Someone has to do it, Gideon said. Might as well be someone who gives a damn. Rhett almost smiled at that. The same words Gideon had said that first morning on the platform, before everything had gone sideways and complicated. He collected his things from Gideon's spare room, settled his bill at the livery, and saddled the bay mare who nickered softly in greeting like she'd been waiting for him to make up his mind about where they were going next. The truth was, he still didn't know. But that was fine. The frontier was big enough that you could ride for years without running out of places to go, people to help, problems to solve. Maybe that was the point. Not finding a destination, but staying in motion, doing what needed doing, and then moving on before you started believing you were more important than the work itself. Rhett rode out of Black Hollow an hour before noon, the sun warm on his back, the mountains ahead promising distance and space and room to breathe. He didn't look back at the town. Didn't need to. It would be there if he ever needed it, same as it had been for the past 12 years, surviving and enduring because of people like Gideon who refused to give up on the idea that civilization could exist even in brutal country. The road ahead was empty, no riders approaching with letters, no traps waiting to spring, just open country and the freedom to choose which direction to go next. After about 5 miles, Rhett pulled the mare to a stop at a creek crossing and let her drink while he considered his options. South toward Colorado, east toward the plains, west toward the coast, north back into Montana. All of them possible. None of them necessary. For the first time in 8 days, Rhett felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Not relief exactly, not peace, but maybe acceptance. The understanding that he couldn't control everything, couldn't prevent every bad thing from happening, couldn't save everyone who needed saving. He could only do what he could do, make the choices in front of him, live with the consequences, keep moving. That had to be enough. Because the alternative, trying to be everywhere, save everyone, prevent every possible tragedy, would destroy him the same way revenge had destroyed Silas. Different method, same result. A life consumed by something impossible until there was nothing left but the ashes. Rhett thought about Mitchell's words again, about playing a character, telling yourself a story about who you were. Maybe that was true. Maybe the legend of Rhett Mercer was just a story, a reputation built on luck and skill and being in the right place at enough right times that people started believing he was something more than human. But underneath the story was a man who got tired, who made mistakes, who sometimes chose mercy when killing would have been smarter, and sometimes chose violence when mercy might have worked. A man who was trying, despite everything, to do more good than harm in a world that made that really difficult. That man wasn't a legend, wasn't a hero, wasn't anything special. He was just someone who kept trying. And maybe, Rhett thought as he urged the mare forward and picked a direction at random, That was all anyone could really ask for. Not perfection, not invulnerability, not the ability to save everyone, just the willingness to keep trying, to keep choosing who was worth fighting for, to keep believing that doing something was better than doing nothing, even when the outcomes were uncertain and the consequences were heavy. The frontier stretched ahead of him, vast and indifferent and full of people who needed help they couldn't get anywhere else. Rhett would find them eventually, would do what he could, would make choices that felt right in the moment, even knowing some of them would turn out to be wrong. And he'd live with it, all of it. The successes and the failures, the people saved and the people he couldn't reach in time, the enemies made and the allies found along the way. Because that was what it meant to be human in a brutal world. Not to be perfect, not to be a legend, just to be someone who kept trying despite knowing deep down that trying would never be quite enough. The sun climbed higher. The mare's hooves found their rhythm on the trail. Behind him, Black Hollow disappeared into the distance. Another town he'd helped and left behind. Another place that would remember his name long after he'd forgotten exactly what he'd done there. Ahead, the mountains waited. Beyond them, more towns, more people, more problems that needed someone willing to step in when everyone else had given up. Rhett Mercer rode toward them at an easy pace, no longer running from anything or chasing after revenge or trying to prove something to people who'd probably believe whatever they wanted, regardless of what he did. He was just a man on a horse, heading somewhere else, carrying the weight of his choices and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more. That was all he'd ever been. And somehow, riding alone into the vastness of the frontier with no destination and no plan, Rhett finally felt like that might actually be enough. The legend could take care of itself. He'd just focus on being human,